All right, so the Treaty of Tordesillas, huh? You want to learn more about it? Well, get ready, because we're going deep on this one.
That we are.
We're talking Spain and Portugal in 1494, literally slicing up the new world between them.
Yeah, just drawing a line and saying, you get this half, we get that half.
Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's hard to believe how much this one treaty changed, well, everything.
I mean, empires, languages, cultures, even the maps we use today, all because of this line in the sand. Or, I guess, the water.
That's the thing about this treaty. It's not just some dusty old document. This was a turning point in history, a moment that really set the stage for the world as we know it.
And the best part is, we get to look at the actual treaty itself.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Surprisingly readable.
And full of little details that'll make you scratch your head.
Like, did you know they sent astrologers with the ships?
Seriously, astrologers.
Sounds like a pirate movie.
Well, it was the age of exploration.
Yeah.
And navigation wasn't exactly a walk in the park back then.
True, they didn't have GPS. So these astrologers, they were like the human GPS.
Basically. They used the stars to figure out where they were. It reminds us that exploration, even back then, was as much about science and smarts as it was about, adventure and finding treasure.
Okay, let's paint a picture here. It's 1494. The age of exploration is in full swing. And you have Spain and Portugal leading the pack, driven by this insatiable hunger for new lands and, let's be honest, riches.
They were locked in this intense competition, each one trying to one-up the other in this race for global dominance.
Like a high-stakes game of Monopoly, but with real-world consequences.
Right, and both of them were riding high on this wave of success. They'd found new sea routes, established colonies, and the wealth was pouring in. Naturally, things were a little tense between them.
Initially, the Pope tried to step in, play referee between these two powerhouses.
Yeah, a few years earlier, he'd issued a decree trying to divide the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal.
But it didn't go over so well, did it?
Not exactly. Portugal felt they got the short end of the stick.
So Spain and Portugal decided, hey, let's just work this out ourselves.
And that's how we got the Treaty of Tordesillas.
It wasn't just about avoiding a fight, though, right? It was about these two countries flexing their muscles, saying, we're in charge now. But how did they actually divide the world? Was it really as simple as just drawing a line on a map?
Believe it or not, yeah, kind of. They literally drew a line down the Atlantic Ocean, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. To the east, Portugal. To the west, Spain. Boom, done.
But hold on. Huge chunks of the world were still uncharted back then, so they were dividing up the globe based on, what, a hunch?
Pretty much. It was a bold move. Imagine having that kind of power to just draw a line and say, this is mine, that's yours. It's a different world back then.
So what about South America? Portugal ended up with Brazil, and Spain got most of the rest. Was that because of this line?
Absolutely. That line had a direct impact on how South America was colonized. At first, it cut right through the continent, giving both countries a claim. But there was also this clause in the treaty all about new discoveries.
So Portugal, they just kept pushing westward, exploring more and more, and eventually they ended up with Brazil.
Exactly. While Spain, they focused more on the west coast of South America, and that's how they ended up with places like Peru, Chile, and Argentina. It's crazy to think this line, drawn so long ago, is still visible in the borders we see on maps today.
It really makes you wonder, what if they'd drawn that line a little differently? History could have taken a completely different turn.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about who got what land. This treaty had a huge impact on the cultures that developed in those regions.
Like the languages.
Exactly. Thanks to the treaty, Brazilians speak Portuguese, while most of the rest of South America speaks Spanish. It's just one example of how this agreement's legacy still resonates today.
Okay, so they drew this line, but how did they actually make sure everyone stuck to it? Did they send ships out with, like, giant rulers to measure it out in the ocean?
Well, yeah, basically. They sent out these expeditions packed with experts, pilots, sailors, and, yep, you guessed it, astrologers.
Those astrologers, they really got around.
They were essential. These expeditions were all about using their combined knowledge to measure out this line in the middle of the ocean. Can you imagine that? Out there on the open sea, two rival nations working together to literally map out their future empires.
Wait, so they actually cooperated, even though they were competing with each other?
It was a strange mix of rivalry and collaboration. They wanted to divide the world, but they also needed to work together to make it happen. History is rarely black and white, It's full of these shades of gray, moments of cooperation, even in the midst of conflict.
I'm starting to realize this treaty was much more than just a line on a map. It was a whole process, a complex dance of exploration, negotiation, and ambition.
And it's a reminder that history is full of surprises. Who would have thought that astrologers would play such a crucial role in shaping the modern world?
This is getting really interesting, but I have to ask, what about all the unknown territories? What if they stumbled upon a new island or continent? Did they just plant a flag and say, finders keepers?
Actually, they had planned for that. They knew exploration was full of surprises, so the treaty had clauses for those scenarios too.
Oh, this is getting good. We're just scratching the surface here, folks. We've got a lot more to uncover about this treaty's twists and turns and its lasting impact on the world. All right, so we know the Treaty of Tordesillas split the world between Spain and Portugal. But how did they actually pull that off? Sending ships out to measure that line? I mean, that must have been a logistical nightmare back in the 15th century.
Oh, absolutely, especially with the navigation tools they had back then. Imagine no accurate clocks for measuring longitude.
Yeah.
Figuring out where you were at sea was a real challenge.
So how did they manage? Just sail west and hope for the best?
Not quite. They relied heavily on the stars and the sun, using celestial navigation. The treaty actually required a joint expedition, 2 to 4 ships, crewed by experts from both sides. We're talking seasoned pilots, astrologers, sailors the A-team.
Those astrologers again, they were like the rock stars of exploration.
Their knowledge of the stars was key for navigating the vast oceans. It's amazing, really, these experts from rival nations working side by side on these tiny ships, sharing knowledge, debating calculations, all to pinpoint this crucial line that would divide their empires.
It's like a high seas drama with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. Did the treaty get specific about how to measure this line?
Oh yeah, they started at the Cape Verde Islands and sailed 370 leagues west.
Leagues? What's a league?
Well, it was a unit of distance based on how far a ship could travel in an hour. But the exact length, well, it depended on who you asked.
So not exactly a standardized measurement then. That's got to cause some arguments.
You bet. And there was a tight deadline. They had just 10 months to get this expedition organized and sailing. Imagine the pressure. Ships to equip, crews to assemble, supplies to gather, and all while coordinating between 2 competing empires.
And don't forget the dangers of sailing back then. Storms, diseases, shipwrecks. It took guts to set out on a voyage like that.
No doubt about it. These voyages were risky business. But that just goes to show how important it was to both countries to establish that boundary, to define their spheres of influence.
Okay, so they set off on these expeditions, astrolabes in hand, ready to mark that line. But what happened when they ran into new land? Did they just plant a flag and claim it no matter what side of the line it was on?
Well, they actually anticipated that. The treaty stated that any land discovered within the other nation's designated zone would belong to them, regardless of who found it. It was their way of trying to manage the unknown, to have some rules for dealing with new discoveries.
That's pretty forward-thinking for the time. But wasn't there some controversy around Brazil? Didn't that throw a wrench in the works?
The discovery of Brazil did raise some questions. It showed how the treaty, while ambitious, had its limits. Remember, that line was drawn based on a very incomplete picture of the world. As exploration continued, they found places that didn't quite fit into their neat little boxes.
So what about Brazil? Did Portugal just ignore the treaty and claim it anyway?
Not exactly. While the original line would have put most of Brazil in Spain's territory, the treaty also allowed for new discoveries. And the Portuguese, they kept exploring, pushing westward, and eventually they claimed that vast land that became Brazil.
So the treaty, it was rigid in a way, but it also had some flexibility built in for those unexpected discoveries.
You got it. And that's important to keep in mind. The Treaty of Tordesillas wasn't a static document. It evolved as they learned more about the world.
But all these new discoveries, these changing boundaries, that must have led to some tension between Spain and Portugal, right?
Oh, there were definitely disagreements, especially when other European powers got involved, looking to grab their own piece of the pie. But for a while, the treaty did help keep things in check, preventing a major war between Spain and Portugal over these new lands.
It's incredible how one document could have such a lasting impact. It shaped exploration, colonization, and even the map of the Americas as we know it. But you mentioned other European powers. They must have been watching all this unfold, eager to get in on the action. Did the Treaty of Tordesillas affect how they approached colonization?
That's a great question. The treaty was mainly between Spain and Portugal, but it did set a kind of precedent, this idea of dividing the world with lines on a map. And that, whether we like it or not, had a big influence on how countries like England, France, and the Netherlands went about building their own empires.
So even though other countries weren't bound by the treaty, it still influenced their actions.
Exactly. It introduced this concept of claiming territory just by drawing lines, a concept that was pretty new at the time. And while other powers might have challenged the specific lines drawn by Spain and Portugal, they didn't necessarily disagree with the idea itself.
It's like everyone was playing follow the leader, but the prize was global domination.
You could say that.
Hmm.
It's fascinating how a simple agreement between two countries ended up having such a huge impact on the entire world.
Ah.
And we haven't even talked about its lasting legacy on international law, territorial sovereignty, and the ethical questions surrounding colonization.
You've given me a lot to think about. This is really eye-opening. I can't wait to hear more about the long-term effects of the treaty and what it all means for us today. Ready to move on to the final part of our exploration. All right, so we've gone deep on the Treaty of Tordesillas, the line, the astrologers, the whole 9 yards. But the big question is, what was its lasting impact? How did this agreement from over 500 years ago shape the world we live in today?
It's a question historians are still trying to figure out. The legacy of this treaty, it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's about exploration, conquest, cultural exchange, and, yeah, the often devastating impacts of colonialism.
We talked about it earlier, but can we dig a little deeper into the Americas? That line on a map, it seems directly connected to the languages, the cultures, even the borders we see today.
It's a perfect example of how a simple agreement can have these ripple effects that last for centuries. Think about it. The treaty basically determined which European power would control which parts of the Americas. Portugal got Brazil, Spain took much of the rest of South America, and large chunks of North America, too.
So that line, it was like the blueprint for building empires in the New World. And those empires, they shaped everything, the people, the languages, the religions, the whole cultural landscape of the Americas.
Exactly. Look at the languages spoken in South America today. Spanish is dominant in most countries, a direct result of Spanish colonization. But in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, and that's thanks to the treaty. It's incredible. Decisions made centuries ago still affecting something as basic as the language people speak.
It's mind-blowing. It wasn't just language and culture, though, right? This treaty, it had a huge impact on the world's economy, on who had power and who didn't.
Oh, absolutely. The treaty opened the floodgates for wealth to flow from the Americas to Europe. Portugal, with their control of the eastern route to the Indies, they had that lucrative spice trade. Spain, looking west, they stumbled upon mountains of silver and gold in the Americas. All this new wealth, it changed Europe. New industries, wars funded, it even helped shift things from feudalism to capitalism.
So the treaty, in a way, it set the stage for Europe to become this global superpower.
It played a big part, that's for sure. The wealth from the Americas, it fueled European expansion, their dominance on the world stage for centuries to come. But this wealth came at a high price. We can't forget the terrible impact colonization had on indigenous populations.
Right. The arrival of Europeans, they brought disease, displacement, exploitation. Indigenous cultures and ways of life were destroyed. It's a dark chapter in history, and it's directly tied to this treaty and its consequences.
Basically, the treaty gave these European powers a reason, in their minds at least, to claim lands that had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for ages. It legitimized this idea of territorial sovereignty, but it was based on European ideas of ownership, completely ignoring the rights of the people who were already there.
It really makes you think, even agreements made with good intentions, they can have unintended, really harmful consequences. But not everyone just accepted the treaty, right? Other European powers, they weren't happy about Spain and Portugal having a monopoly on the New World.
Exactly. England, France, the Netherlands, as they got better at sailing and exploring, they started to challenge the dominance of Spain and Portugal. They saw opportunities for trade, for resources, for building their own empires. They weren't going to let an old agreement stand in their way.
So the treaty, as powerful as it was, it couldn't stop the tide from turning.
Nope. The world was changing, becoming more connected. The old ways, based on papal decrees and deals between two countries, they were fading away. A new era was dawning, one of global competition and new alliances.
It's amazing this treaty, so powerful at first, eventually became a relic of the past. But even though it faded away, it left behind some important legacies, right?
Absolutely. The Treaty of Tordesillas, for all its problems and its eventual demise, it did contribute to some significant developments. For one, it established this precedent of dividing the world based on lines on a map, and we still see that today in international borders and territorial claims.
So it was a stepping stone, in a way, towards the idea of nation-states and this whole concept of territorial sovereignty as we know it today.
Precisely. By formally dividing the non-European world between two powers, it solidified this idea that land could be claimed, owned, and controlled by countries, even if those claims came from conquest and ignored the rights of indigenous people.
It's a reminder that history is full of these complicated legacies. Something that seems straightforward at the time can have these long-lasting consequences that we're still dealing with today.
And the Treaty of Tordesillas is a prime example of that. It makes us think critically about the past, to acknowledge the wrongs done in the name of empire and progress, and to work towards a world that's more just and fair.
This deep dive has been fascinating and it's definitely given me a lot to think about. The Treaty of Tordesillas is a reminder that the past isn't really gone. It's still shaping the present, even if we don't always see it.
And that's what's so great about history. It's not just dates and facts. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world and using that knowledge to deal with the challenges and opportunities we face today. The Treaty of Tordesillas, with all its twists and turns, its good and its bad, it gives us a way to look at how colonialism still affects us, how international law has evolved, and how the quest for power and resources still shapes the world.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining me on this journey. It's been an eye-opener for sure.